Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. So excited to have you all here with us today. And today we have a really exciting webinar around building a great community. And of course, community and crowd is one of the EXO attributes. And so this is really important to the model that we all believe in as the EXO community. And so I want to introduce everybody to Vanessa, who most of you should know. Vanessa will be moderating this webinar today and will introduce you all to the speakers we have. So Vanessa, over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Happy to provide introductions to our great guests today. Today we have Jono Bacon. He is a community management advisor, speaker, and author of 5 books. The most recent one is titled People Powered: How Communities Can Supercharge Your Business, Brand, and Teams. He was previously a community director for GitHub and XPRIZE and has clients across the spectrum like Google, Intel, Microsoft, Sony Mobile, Santander, and so many more. He also has an incredibly insightful podcast called Conversations with Bacon, highly recommended. And of course, we have Salim Ismail. He's a futurist and best-selling author of Exponential Organizations and Exponential Transformation. Salim has been building disruptive digital companies as a serial entrepreneur since the early 2000s. A prolific speaker, Salim gives more than 150 talks a year to audiences of all sizes around the globe. And he's also the co-founder and chairman of OpenExO, which I'm proud to be a part of, this incredible global transformation ecosystem that we'll dive more into today. So happy to have you both here. Welcome. If you can also let us know where you're calling from, that'd be great to hear.
Thank you. I'm in California, Northern California, in firm and vigorous lockdown right now, like everybody else. So whereabouts are you, Salim?
I'm in Toronto.
Are you locked in as well?
Pretty much locked in, although less risk of what's going on the outside. But yeah, we're pretty much locked down.
Right.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining today. It's kind of nice to have this opportunity to have some content digital. So today we're here to dive into the topic about building great communities and how a strong community can serve as the engine for exponential growth. A thriving community is one of the driving forces behind the world's most powerful brands and movements. From Beyonce's Beehive to Wikipedia to TEDx, if your organization or brand relies on reaching an audience for any type, for any purpose, you seriously should consider starting or being a part of a community. And so to help us dive into this topic, let's jump into some questions. So I like to start with a little bit of context and would love to ask both of you, what in your childhood or early career led you to being a community leader? Let's start with Jono.
Yeah, I remember it vividly. And first of all, thank you for having me here. This is great. I was 18, living at home with my parents, believe it or not, had long hair back in those days. And my hair started growing inwards and coming out my toes when I was about 22 years old. My brother came to stay with us for a couple of weeks. And he introduced me to this technology called open source and Linux, which was pretty young back then in 1998. The internet wasn't really very prevalent in the UK. And I went and bought a book about, about Linux, and I discovered that people all over the world come together to produce this technology together. And the idea being that everyone's digitally connected via the internet, which in itself was interesting back in 1998, let alone what is the combination of workflow, of psychology, of how those people get glued together to create something that they then all share. And this was a relatively unknown prospect back then. It was happening in academia, and now open source powers the world. I mean, it's powering the cloud and data centers and everything else. I was interested in the tech, but I was more interested in that psychological workflow component of how you build those communities. And I realized back then, I want to figure out every detail of how this stuff works, because it's an interesting people and technology question. And that's kind of what got me into it.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Jono. Salim, how about you?
Community. So probably my journey starts in New York City 20 years ago, where I built kind of one of my first tech companies, and it was the predecessor to Twitter. Unfortunately, 18 months too early. Very bad to build a tech company early, as we now know. But in the process of doing that, essentially created a community of and joined the entire global community of bloggers at the time, and got fairly deep into that world and realized the power of a decentralized environment where everybody can act on their own and yet contribute to a broader purpose. And that led to me building a community around Yahoo and the incubator we were building at Yahoo, and then Singularity University, of course, which is essential. And then it's just nonstop since then.
Fantastic, thank you. So to tie into not only a Q&A question that came in from Simon, but one of my main questions here that I have is, what are some of the critical steps? Like how does one start? What do you need to put in place to build a thriving community that will provide value for free or minimal cost? For example, shared identity, MTP. MTP, of course, is one that we talk about a lot with EXO. So Jono, would love to hear some insight from you about starting from scratch, and what are those key building blocks and steps?
Yeah, the way I look at it is, it's everything's got a point to value. So if you've got a community, usually you've got a sense in your head about what the value is that you want to generate. So for example, when I'm working with companies, a very common element to this is going to be, we want our customers to be able to provide support and guidance to each other. We want to increase our brand recognition. We want to have events operating around the world. We want content to be created. These are all different types of value. And I think we have to start with the value for the community member first. One of the mistakes I think a lot of companies make is that they focus on what can we get out of it ourselves. And if you only focus on the value for the company, you'll create a boring community. It just won't be very interesting. The company value will flow, but it's typically associative with the net effect that your community members get out of it. In the same way that, you know, if you go and have a great experience at a restaurant, you tell your friends that you went to that restaurant, the food was great, and you had a good time, and then they go to the restaurant. So to me, defining the value and then prioritizing who are the audiences that you want to focus on. Again, another mistake I often see is that we want everything, right? We want people to run events and create content and further the brand and this, that, and the other. But I think we need to say, what is the most critical audience that we want to focus on? And then we should be intentional about shaping the journey. So one of the things I talk about in my new book, People Powered, is that the best experiences in the world are journeys, right? Again, you go to Disney World, from how you get parked to how you buy your tickets to how they guide you around the park. It's all thought out. And we do the same thing with communities. We define our audience, we onboard them so they can generate that value for themselves as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And then there's 3 phases of a typical community journey. You start out as a casual member where you're new and weird and don't know anyone and feel very uncomfortable. There's a lot of imposter syndrome. And then once you've built the habit for about 2 months, about 60 days is scientifically how long it takes to build a habit, you then become a regular. And then at that point, you're a little bit more ingrained in the community, but it's about getting stuff done and meeting your other fellow community members and collaborating. And then the final phase is a very small number of people become very core members, where they don't just care about their experience, they care about the broader experience of the community too. So to me, when you define that value and it shapes that entire journey and you're intentional about that journey, that's how you get the very best communities.
Fantastic, really clear steps. Salim, I know you, really place a lot of emphasis on MTP being the guiding light. So I'd love to hear your eloquent take on that and sharing your thoughts around that.
Well, I don't know about eloquent, but I'll certainly take a crack at it. So I think we typically start with the MTP because we find if that lines up, then everything else goes more easily. And people can find interest in multiple areas. I may be interested in curing cancer and I'll go join a community on that. I may be interested in Linux and I'll go join a community on that. But if we start with the core purpose for what the community is trying to achieve, then I think everybody can decide very quickly to what extent are they in or out. And it makes it much easier for them to self-select to be in to whatever level of commitment they want to contribute to that massive purpose. And that's one. And I think the best definition I have heard about community is when you generate peer-to-peer value creation in the community. So when you can have members connecting with members and creating value independent of the organizing body, that's when you have true community. Then it scales naturally. And so that's the holy grail that we think you go for in terms of value creation. Value creation plus the massive purpose essentially is the holy grail around that.
Can I just want to underline 2 points that you just made, Salim, which I think are super important. Like you mentioned about the purpose element. For people who are watching this who haven't read much about behavioral economics, Dan Ariely, who writes a lot about how we're irrational creatures in very consistently irrational ways, talks a lot about that purpose and how important it is. And the communities that really are the separating factor is they do have that purpose. And I think it ties very neatly into your second point, Salim, which is I've seen a lot of communities out there who, for example, want to solve major challenges in the world. And there's a lot of appetite for it, but it doesn't tie to something practical that they can do. So they tend to form around and be excited about the problem, but then unless there's something that they can actually feed into, then that enthusiasm tends to wane. And that's where the peer-to-peer piece really plays in, is that, you know, if somebody can go in there and create something or add some value that they can learn from their fellow community members, it's incredibly powerful. That combo is super powerful.
Do you have any specific examples of who's really mastering that peer-to-peer engagement that you both are speaking of?
I mean, I know I've used this as an example earlier, but in the open source world, I think it's one of the finest examples of that, which is you'll take a new technology project. Like this is happening right now with COVID-19. You know, there are numerous open source projects that have spun up for understanding the data that's been put out there, creating maps and visualizations of that data, finding if existing drugs are being effective in some form with COVID. And what happens is these projects live somewhere like GitHub, and the way in which people collaborate is they create some code or a new feature and they propose it for inclusion into that project. And the other engineers, the other participants in the project go and review that code to evaluate whether it needs fixing, if it needs improving. And then if it's good, they accept it in. So you get this very, very strong level of peer review and participation. The key thing I've noticed is that this tends to work most well in an online setting. You do get kind of in-person mentoring, of course, that's very prominent, but when people can collaborate electronically, whether it's content, whether it's technology, whether it's other things, it creates an easier setting where people can review digital material, whether it's code, whether it's written material or whatever, and that enables better peer review. But the learning that you get from that is profound. I mean, I know community members who have shaped their entire career, not from their degree, but from what they experienced and accomplished inside of a community.
Thank you. And so we did touch right there on online communities, and so many people associate community building with physical proximity, hosting weekly events, meetups, networking, that sort of thing. But now with the rise of remote working, especially with COVID-19 lockdowns, we're forced to basically reimagine the ways we connect with people. You know, grandparents are learning how to FaceTime. So the EXO community has over 3,500 members from 100 countries speaking 30 languages. And Salim, would love to hear your take on, you know, what you think the EXO community did in order to achieve that growth and expansion that is beyond physical limitations and really lives online.
So, you know, I think there's a couple of things that we've done. One is we found a massive purpose that we got excited about, and we've kind of stuck to that. And it really is massive. We want to transform the world. And so that's kind of a high order, a pretty big picture. I think that's one reason that's caused a fair bit of interest. I think the second is that we, about 6-8 months ago, we opened it up. It was kind of invite only up to that point, and then we opened it up and jumped from a few hundred people to almost 4,000 very, very quickly. I think the third is that we're providing tool sets for people to go implement by themselves. So they're not dependent on us. They're not beholden to us. They all then contribute back into those tool sets because it makes it better. And we're essentially driving a completely new level of engagement where they can pick up these tools and go implement in their local environments and not even tell us. And that's great. And so I think the combination of those three is getting people very excited about what we're doing. The harder one, I think, is, I remember talking to Chris Anderson when he was building his drones, DIY drones community, which is 300,000 people. And he said you have to put kind of 2 hours a day into it, nurturing the community, being there, etc. And bluntly, I'm terrible at that. I've done a pretty horrible job of it, and the community has grown in spite of me kind of being AWOL for large periods of time and not being that responsive, etc., because we've been just so busy. I think it's a testament to the mechanisms, if you put into place, will have it succeed no matter what. Now we're going kind of full out with this new event that we're doing, and we'll see what happens if we can transition to creating a global conversation about what's happening in the world. So we'll see.
Thank you, Salim. And Jono, since it's a hot topic right now, would love to also hear from you about the patterns you're seeing in successful online communities.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting. One of the things that I've been talking quite a bit about, particularly since I launched the book in November, is that we're seeing this trend forming towards communities. If you look at in the last 5 or 10 years, the relationship between people and brands is changing. So, 10 years ago, if you had if you went and bought a product, you'd engage with a company via their customer support number. And then the internet became more and more prevalent. People started doing digital marketing towards their customers with email newsletters and this, that, and the other. And everybody's now walking around with cell phones in their pockets. We've seen the cost of internet access drop significantly, especially in places such as India, where it's cheaper than in the UK and the US now. And what I think is especially interesting is as we're seeing younger generations form, such as millennials, people are growing up with access to social technology. It's just part and parcel of their normal lives. So, excuse me. So, to me, what's interesting here is that people are growing up and expecting a relationship with the companies and the brands that they care about. And if you look at Salesforce, Sephora, Adidas, Procter & Gamble, Harley Davidson, they've all built significant communities. I mean, one example is Fitbit, with a community of 1.8 million people. These people are not just asking questions about Fitbit trackers. They're asking how to swim better and how to run more efficiently and how to eat the right kinds of foods. So the patterns that we're seeing, I think, are around demand, but also we're starting to understand more now the organizational elements of how you build a community into a business, because this to me has been one of the areas where it's really struggled, is that you can identify, if we have an online meeting place where people can come and hang out with each other, the technology's existed reasonably for a while. I think where there's been a lot of confusion is, okay, well, how do you hire the right people for this? How do you bring them in? How do you integrate that into the business? How do you, communities are fundamentally cross-functional and collaborative. So these use cases that we're seeing, I think, are validating the model. And now we're really getting into the business practices of how you build online communities into a business.
Thank you, Jono. And Salim, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that summarizes it pretty well. I think that's a great way of approaching it. And I think the question, one of the fascinating questions I have for you, Jono, is as you look at communities, they tend to morph over time. And how do you navigate that morphing? Do you just go with it, or do you try and keep it true to the original purpose? Because that often happens, and we're kind of dealing with that ourselves to some extent.
I think that's such a great question, Salim. I mean, it's what I think is fascinating about communities for many people, but is also a little terrifying for many businesses, is that they're a little bit like children. You want to provide a community with the right level of support and the right guardrails. So it's easy to join the community, it's simple to onboard. You've got structured programs for helping people to do great work and participate and to build that sense of belonging, which is so fundamental to why communities work. But then you also need to, again, like kids, you need to give them enough freedom and enough flexibility where people can can figure out their own future. And the way I typically look at this is, I mentioned earlier on that when people join a community, they're casual members and then they become regulars, and then a very few people become core. When people become those core members, you want to incorporate them into how you build out your community. So, using OpenExO as an example, what I would recommend would be, the core members who all of you will know by name as just people who are really fundamentally doing amazing work in the community. Include them as best you can into discussions about, well, what should we be doing moving forward? How do we better serve the needs and the ideas that are in our community members? Because I think what makes communities work and what makes them so powerful at the most fundamental level is that they are a network of minds, talent, and experience. And usually when we bring that network into our businesses, we have a sense of what talent we want and what expertise we want to kind of unpack. But as part of that, you get all of this extra talent and expertise and insight in for the ride as well. And I think you need your community members to be able to help to shape what that looks like. There are many times when I've done this previously where a community member will say, I'm noticing that there's just a lot of interest in people who I know in the community in this other particular area. And you maybe set up a small working group where you can kind of explore that a little bit. So opening the door, I think, will help with that, but doing it in conjunction with your community members.
Yeah, they're kind of not shy. They kind of tell us what they want anyway. So now
Indeed.
No wallflowers, right?
That's right.
At all hours.
Right.
Okay. If you were looking into the future in the ways that things are digitizing, we're talking about the dynamic nature of communities. What are some of the opportunities and challenges that people who are either managing or involved with communities should be aware of? For example, Lewis posted a question about UBI and UBI contributing to community building. So any challenges or opportunities that we can talk about and open up a discussion about here?
I think the one that we're focused on, the biggest challenge we have, and if we can make it work, then I think we have a kind of a holy grail, is to create a business model for participating in the community. And so if you can, in terms of, for example, our mission of transformation, a lot of people want to transform the world and do good stuff, but they're stuck making money in the old economy. So they participate as a hobby or on the side. If we can find a business model for them to work on that transformation, then you hit both their passion plus a monetary and upside. And then I think you have pretty much you're unstoppable at that point. And so something we're thinking about is how do you create, and working on is how do you create that business model for that? And if we can navigate that, then we're in great shape.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think the incentives are critical here. And I think if you can tap into that business model, that would be really powerful. The tricky thing, I think, from what I've seen with money as it plays a role in communities, is that a lot of the value in communities is intangible. So you can spend money on people doing things. And there are lots of examples of this. Hit Record, for example, which was founded by Joseph Gordon-Levitt. He contributed some content to People Powered. This is where people can collaborate together on a creative project. And then if it gets shown on television, whoever contributed to that project, they share in the royalties, which I think is a really interesting model. And that's actually worked really well within the context of Hit Record. But then in other communities, when people start paying people for individual contributions, it can sometimes be a little bit more complicated. But I agree with you, Salim, that I think there is a model out there that can make this work. I think that in terms of the question of the challenges and opportunities, I think one thing that we're especially seeing right now with remote working, and I think there's going to be a great demand for people to build internal communities of remote workers. And there's always a challenge there where you've got some people in an office and some people who are online. Most communities on the internet they're naturally online, and then they have bits of in-person events. And the challenge there is when you have people, for example, in an office, you need to get the whole company into the habit of documenting outcomes into your electronic platform, because that's what unifies the understanding. And that's really tough. Remote working is not a technology challenge. It is a culture challenge in how you do that well. And I don't think the current tools that we have are very effective for that. You know, people usually say, well, go and dump what we said into a Google Doc. And a lot of people just don't do that. Human beings don't naturally take notes. We're just not wired up that way. So I think there's a great opportunity to hot rod that fusion of online and in person with more effective documentation.
Yeah, there's a lot of good opportunity for, you know, companies or startups to launch around this new wave of remote working and online connection. So looking forward to seeing a lot of that. So one of the main challenges, and Lance Pepler added this question into the chat here, is engagement. It's a clear indicator of the health of your community. The quote, "They come for the ideas, but stay for the connections," always comes to mind. So what are some of the patterns that you all are seeing in highly engaged communities? And can you give advice on how to help generate engagement? We'll start with Salim again.
So, you know, it's important here to let's just define what we mean by community. In our framing for our world and in the purposes and the framing of the book, Exponential Organizations, we define community as that set of people that are engaged with you in some way or the other. They're your customers, your partners, your fans, your suppliers, your vendors, your users, etc. If they're not engaged with you and they're on the outside, then that's the crowd, right? And when I was talking about monetization earlier in a business model, Uber, for example, has found a good way of tapping in and finding a business model for the crowd. There's a few companies like Xiaomi that have done a good job of navigating the community to figure out and a business model around them to add incredible value. For those who aren't aware, Xiaomi is a Chinese cell phone company that has no PR or marketing costs. They have a community of 2,000 super users. And they've created an engine where those 2,000 people get to vote on the features coming into the new phone. They then get the phone early and can boast, hey, I have the phone and I voted for this feature. And that just generates all of their marketing. So they have zero PR marketing costs. Everything is driven by the community. And that would be a successful, most big companies do a terrible job of even acknowledging their community, let alone building it. And Jono, you've probably seen this, where the first community you can start with is your own internal employees. They're not even in a community. The tools that we've seen for engagement around that, the best one we've seen is just straight gamification and loyalty type programs and reward mechanisms. We found that incentive prizes are really good for turning crowd into community, and then use gamification for maintaining engagement within the community.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, Salim. The way I tend to look at it is there are different types of engagement for different types of communities. So the way I would characterize it is there's three broad models of communities. You've got consumers who get together because they have a shared interest, a shared passion, such as Star Trek fans who get together. The champion communities is where people go a step beyond and they create content, events, provide support to their fellow community members. And then collaborator communities are where people get together to create something together. So the incentives vary depending on the model that you've got. Because, for example, in a collaborator community, a lot of the engagement there is going to be around contributions to the shared thing that you're building, whereas maybe in the consumer one, you're going to be much more focused on discussion and that kind of engagement. I think the key thing in my mind is that we need to focus on not just action with engagement, but we need to focus on the validation. So what I mean by that is, in the early days of community building, for example, people would put forums up on the internet and they'd have these little numbers at the side, in the sidebar, that would say, you know, if you've posted 500 times, you will get this particular badge. It's kind of a rudimentary form of gamification. But the problem with it is that people would post just rubbish, just nonsense, just so they could get the number up. So when you identify an engagement model, it will change people's behavior. And what I'm more interested in is I'd like to track what people are doing and how they're engaging, but also what is the quality of that engagement? Are they posting high quality material? Are they creating high quality content? So to me, what we do is we identify which of those models of the community we're focusing on, and identify which of those phases where, you know, community members going through, and just identify a very small focused number of things that you want to track in terms of engagement. Because if there's one thing I've learned over the years more than anything, is the way in which you build great communities is to start with something, start simple, and then just look at the data and see how it's changing, you know, because the data will tell you what screws you need to turn. You know, for example, if you're not getting a lot of people signing up to your new community, well, maybe the value of your community isn't crisply communicated enough. If you're seeing a lot of growth in terms of people coming to your community, well, maybe that's because there is a lot of value that's being repeatedly consumed. So pick a small set of things, but track both the action as well as the quality of the action as well.
Great advice. Thank you, Jono. And something you said earlier, which I think struck for the attendees, Eric put a question here. He asked, should companies no longer be concerned with building a brand and be more focused on building a community? We can start with Jono.
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think they are the same thing, or they're very closely connected. I mean, your brand is fundamentally important in my mind. But I think the brand in the old days of marketing was the thing that the marketing team owned, right? So they'd protect the brand, you know, almost viciously at times in terms of how that brand could be used. They'd have design, language, and voice, which had to be vigorously protected. And I think what we're seeing today across many organizations is that the brand is a shared representation of a group of people. You know, I'll give you a concrete example of this. Wendy's, the fast food chain, if anyone's seen their social media account, their Twitter account, it's hilarious. They've obviously hired stand-up comedians to post tweets out there. And what's interesting about that is that they don't come across as a stuffy, you know, traditional brand. They come across as a modern, vibrant brand because they figured out a way to engage more effectively with their audience. So the brand to me is a language that is used to communicate with you and your audience. And what's inherently connected into that is your community. So I think what you need to do is you need to focus on building your brand and building awareness around it, but make the brand something that people want to use as a badge of honor when it comes to being part of that community. One of the finest examples of that I've seen in recent years is Peloton. People who make these, they make these exercise bikes with live classes in New York. Peloton, we've got one. Peloton fans are just obsessive about Peloton.
I think insane
Peloton is
the technical term.
Right. Right. I never thought that I would enjoy, you know, someone screaming at me in a studio in New York to pedal faster, but I found that I liked it too. But what happens is they've built such a community around their product and around their brand that people want to wear the brand because it represents them and their ethos well. So I think you need both.
Great answer. Salim, anything you want to add there?
I think there's a great question in here and a great debate around, is your community the brand anyway? And we're finding more and more that your brand is really just a conversation about you in the community. And if you don't have a positive relationship there, then your brand pretty much doesn't matter after that. There's a great story from a few years ago where Dell was doing a really bad job in customer service. And their customer in their community just went and created a Twitter tag called Dell Help. And people started tweeting the stories of how horrible the customer service was. And the stock price dropped right now. So this is a direct correlation in very, very uncertain terms of how dramatically the impact can be if you don't deal properly with your community. And as we mentioned earlier, most of the companies do a very, very bad job of it. And the ones that do a good job of it do unbelievably well. And Peloton is a great example that Jono just mentioned. And so it's kind of like an obvious thing. It's such a duh, and yet big companies don't do it at all, right? Think about this, the idea that 99% of the conversation in any big company is about what's happening in the company. I mean, right there, that tells you the problem. And so it's a structural issue that we have to overcome.
One other thing just to touch on very briefly as well is that I mentioned earlier on that communities are cross-functional. You know, they require, you can't just have one community manager who comes into your company and manages your community. It requires, everyone needs to have their skin in the game across multiple different departments. And where the rubber really hits the road often is with marketing teams, where you want to say, we want to broaden our brand out a little bit, and we want to protect the brand integrity, but we want to enable people to use it effectively. To give you an example, when I was at Canonical and we were building Ubuntu, we had very, very crisp brand guidelines around how you could use our brand, but we allowed anyone to take the Ubuntu brand and to use it in their local user groups and beyond. So you'd see these, you know, the Ubuntu brand within the context of Brazil and in France. We had 180 groups around the world, but there was a long conversation with the marketing team around how we did that. So I think if you enable people to use your brand effectively, but you protect it so it can't be abused, then you really do open the door to get the Peloton style experience.
Fantastic. And along the lines, we're talking about marketing teams and that cusp between branding and community. So we had a question come in and they're asking about how to expand the global community and empower them, but also establish a content process that remains true to the brand without restricting community autonomy. So let's talk a little bit about content and maybe, you know, that Peloton examples, and dive into that to answer the question here for this anonymous attendee. Jonah, go ahead.
Should I go? Okay. Yeah, I mean, a couple of thoughts on content. One is that one of the most effective ways of building a community is a regular stream of content. And one of the challenges that a lot of companies face is that they set up their infrastructure for delivering content. They have their social media accounts and their blog and their YouTube channel. And they say, well, we'll put content out when we've got time. And then they never have time. So you see a drip grab of content that comes out. So again, we have to be intentional, have a content calendar and stick to it. But one of the things here that's really powerful with communities is that if you evaluate whatever data you've got to determine what kind of content works well for you, and this varies from company to company, is that you define like, well, what content do we want to put out moving forward, and then engage with your community members to enable them to generate content for you, to put it out there. To give you an example, there's a company called Red Hat, and they set up opensource.com, which was just a news site for how people can learn about open source and technology. They have over 1 million page views a month and a huge community that's publishes over 500 articles a year. They don't pay them at all. But there's very clear incentives in place and, you know, clear editorial process for how people can contribute content to it. So one of the things I would always recommend here is see your community members, especially the regulars and the core members, as very viable people who will be open to generating content for you. The key thing, I think, is that what people don't like when they create content is they don't like the editorial piece. So simplify how they can create the raw material, and then you can help to edit it and lay it out and put it in place. And then you can achieve that regular content calendar of material that's going out there. Now, again, this can often kick off a question when it comes to marketing, which is, well, what do we consider to be okay? There are some marketing departments that are incredibly locked down. They say, it has to go through our team. We have to maintain these standards in terms of voice. I think it's okay to dial that back a bit. It's okay to have content that's maybe not quite so sheened, but really there's more of it that's out there as well. So to me, when we get that balance right, it's pretty powerful.
Salim, anything you'd like to add about content?
It's the same as the value creation comment. The more that the community can generate content, the better. In a holy grail from an exponential organization perspective, the community is the company, and you have very little at the core. The entire purpose of the organization then becomes to just support the community in the way that and the most successful example we saw of that was Chris Anderson's DIY drones community. 300,000 people, drones enthusiasts, all very passionate about that topic. And if you got stuck on configuring some drone or something, you literally posted up an answer when you went to bed at night and you had the answer in the morning, and boom, you're off to the races. And the collective learning that takes place, as Jono mentioned earlier, is profound. When it became time for creating products, they simply said, what do you guys want? And the community went, do you want DIY kits? Okay, great, there's our product. And so asking the community and then just responding to them becomes the simplest form of product development you could ever hope for. And if you maintain, then the role of the core team is simply to maintain the mass MTP or the massive purpose, etc. And then everything else cascades from there, you know. And I think Linux and other organizations like that have done an amazing job of navigating and creating loose structures where people can plug in as they feel where they want to and where they want to contribute, and then let the whole thing just organically develop that way. Those structures are also incredibly resilient in the face of any kind of you look at what's happening today, all the community-driven companies are going to do very, very well. Yeah, and all the ones that are not community-driven are in really, really deep trouble.
And the other thing as well, just to again underline, I think something really important that you touched on, Salim, is using DIY drones as an example. When people would have questions about how to configure their drone, and it's a very, very technical community, we don't go to websites anymore to ask those questions. We don't go and look at the list of frequently asked questions list. We type into Google. So the benefit of all of that content being online, either created content such as blog posts or YouTube videos, or community members asking each other questions, it's all indexed on Google. So the benefit of that is that pulls people into your community. This is one of the reasons why there's been an increasing popularity of people using forums for communities, and Slack is struggling more, because anyone who's tried to find any kind of previous discussion in Slack, it just doesn't work. And they claim it works and it doesn't. But if you search for something online, 9 times out of 10, what you'll be able to find is a community forum where people have had those conversations. So that discoverability of content, using your example of DIY drones, Salim, is, I think, incredibly valuable.
You guys shared some incredible examples there, and we had some questions come in. Sanjay has some specific examples that he's asking about. What is the fastest a large community was built, and what made it so, to your knowledge? So let's start with that one. We have 2 others from Sanjay. Salim or Jono, feel free to take this one.
You know, it depends on, again, how you define community. I think Peloton is a recent example of an incredibly fast-growing community. But if you think about communities, peer-to-peer value creation, then I think the TED community is probably one of the fastest growing. And note how what they did was they let the community drive TEDx events. And he went from one conference once a year with a few thousand people in Monterey, in California, to a global media brand, just by letting community build that out. And Laura Stein, who created TEDx, is now trying to do the same thing with BOMA, and creating a global community around that, a new model. So I think going from 0 to millions of users, billions of YouTube views, etc., is probably the most dramatic example I've seen.
There are a couple that spring to mind on my side. One would be Fitbit. I think Fitbit, when they opened up their community, I mean, that really sprang into action. And one of the reasons why that was because they already had a community of customers. Well, they already had a customer base, but they were like so many businesses. They were all independent nodes. They weren't connected together yet into the community. So when they launched their community, it really did kind of grow very substantially and very quickly, and there was a lot of value. And there's a risk to that, you know. If you grow too quickly, sometimes it can just seem like a lot of noise and a lot of chaos. So there's an element of measuring out your growth to do it effectively. But another example that's been very profound, and this is more on the tech side, is a project called Kubernetes, which was a project that was kicked off by Google to essentially, I won't get into the nerdery of it, but it's essentially, it makes it easier to build large-scale cloud services. And that became one project within something called the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is like a community-based foundation. And there are hundreds of major companies, many of which compete with each other, all participating in this community together. And they grew enormously within the space of a matter of months. And it's changed how the industry works. So yeah, there are many examples out there, and some of the largest ones, like some of the anime forums, you know, are hundreds of millions of people. It's pretty crazy.
Some of my favorite aspects about these giant movements and communities is the authenticity that just shows between, like you said, between their social media posts and their content, but also trust and transparency are key. And Sanjay wanted to know, what are some of the examples of organizations that have been phenomenal in leveraging trust and transparency?
Ooh, Jono, you go first there. You've got probably a dozen examples.
There's one that really jumps out to my mind because it's a cool story to share. There is a company called GitLab that creates a platform for people building tech. And about 3 years ago, one of their engineers fat-fingered an update and the whole thing went down. And, so they went to the backup and the backup didn't work. And they went to the second backup and the second backup didn't work. They went through 11 stages of this and it was a bad day for a business. And most companies in that scenario, they would tell their market and PR people to close the doors. They would focus on trying to solve the problem privately, and then they would publish the groveling summary afterwards. GitLab didn't do that. They started a Google Doc, and they asked their community to help them diagnose what the problem was. They had a live YouTube stream of them trying to fix the problem. And they didn't fire the engineer who caused the problem. So they demonstrated a remarkable level of transparency. And what was interesting was it caused this trend of people called Hugs for GitLab, where the community admired that transparency and they supported them for it. They welcomed them into the tent. And I thought what was fascinating about that was either an impeccably well-handled disaster, or it was the most brilliant marketing PR stunt that I've ever seen. I don't think it was a PR stunt, but to me, that's one of the most notable ones that I've seen.
Thank you. Salim, anything you want to add?
Yeah, no, I think transparency, both transparency and trust are incredibly important. There's a section in my book, which is one of my favorites, which is that trust beats control and open beats closed. And if you are willing to take on that mantra, then pretty much anything is possible. In fact, one of our folks, Jerry Mikulski, has made the incredibly important observation that scarcity is abundance minus trust. And you have to kind of sit and think about that for like an hour.
Yeah.
And he makes the further point that almost all of our institutions are built for mistrust. We validate, we authenticate, we ratify, and almost all government functions are basically saying, we're checking that you're not doing the wrong thing. And if you can figure out how to navigate an environment with trust, then essentially all of that stuff falls away. And now you operate in a truly interesting environment, and you create a different set of rules and a different set of mechanisms to operate off that. And we find examples of this everywhere. Burning Man is an example. The maker movement, the open source community is a wonderful example of this. And we're creating more and more examples of that as time goes by, because technology is delivering abundance to the world. And with that, we need a complete revolution in how we navigate communities and therefore how we navigate trust.
Good point. And this segues into, the question around compensation and, the monetary topic when it comes to community. Simon posted a question, what about collaboration community where people need to put in more hours and actual work to build something? How do you best incentivize a collaboration community? Is money a must? Jono, what do you think there?
I don't think it's a must. And in many cases, money is not a large factor to this when we look at some existing examples. In fact, money can be very challenging when it comes to collaboration communities. I'll give you an example. GitHub, which is a large software development platform, introduced a feature called GitHub Sponsors, where people could go and essentially provide a donation to a developer for doing some work. And my worry about when you provide the donation to the individual is that it will naturally reward the people who are doing the really exciting, adding the new features and all this kind of stuff into the project. But there are many people out there who are doing the really, really boring grunt work. refactoring projects and creating tests and documentation and things like that. That's just not interesting, but you have to do it. There's the chef, and then there's the people who are going to do the dishes. And so I think you need to make sure that your compensation piece ideally benefits the community, and then people can get access to those funds. That's what we did in a previous project that I was involved with. People could contribute to the project, and then we would issue the funds based upon the need. Now, the one thing that we are seeing, I think, in many communities is there are communities of professionals, people who are paid to do something. And again, another example of this is in the tech world, where there are many people who are paid engineers who are working on collaborative communities. My example of Kubernetes is a good example of that. There are not that many volunteers, I would argue, in that world. Most people are paid employees. It's difficult when one of the areas where this becomes challenging is when you build internal communities. Like I've worked with, for example, large banks who are building internal communities. And the expectation initially is we want our employees to go and contribute to the community in addition to doing all the work that they've already got to do. And that doesn't work. You've got to say to those people, you need to make time. And it's the eternal question. If we do this, what aren't we, what other thing aren't we doing? So I think if you're expecting people to be able to contribute to a community and there is a pressure around them getting paid, you need to either have a good model for the incentives, such as a monetary model, or internally you need to give them the time to do that. But it's a very delicate balance. The vast majority of communities are volunteer in nature. They don't have that kind of formal compensation piece to them.
Interesting. Salim, do you have anything you'd like to add around monetary compensation?
Yeah, I mean, at one level, it's the holy grail to find a business model for what the community is trying to do. On the other hand, money is very delicate, right? And the example that Jono gave is a great example of how do you do it in an equitable way, and people are naturally going to find some problem with however you structure it. We had this huge issue when I was kind of spending a lot of time building Singularity University, that you'd run an event and all the alumni expect free tickets, which was great when we had like 100 alumni, but when you have like 20,000, that becomes kind of a, what do you do with this now? And the expectation was set, and now you have to navigate it in a very delicate way. And the folks that have come to all the event, they go, well, this is ridiculous. And then you end up with the natural curmudgeonry in the organization and in the community, and everybody's unhappy in some way, shape, or form. And it was a really, really tricky model to navigate. That's one. I think the best outcome is if you can create some sort of karma reward points, or like a love machine type of construct, and I'll describe what I mean by that in a second. And then create a time delay between that and a conversion into money of some kind. Then I think you get people buying into it for the game of it and for the fun of it. And then if it's valuable, great. And that's, I think, some of the things we're trying to do in our world. Just the love machine, as an example that Philip Rosedale put together, he created Second Life. And so in his model, when they do employee bonuses, they essentially give every employee 1,000 stock options, everybody in a team 1,000 stock options, and the task is to give that 1,000 stock options to other people in the team. And so if you think two people did great, you can give 500 each, or you can give equally across the whole team if you're a full communist, or you can do kind of this person's great, etc. And what you found out was exactly how who was creating the most value. When you added it up at the end, you had an anonymous a meritocracy of who got the most stock options. Of everybody considers that person has added the most value. And I think that's a really interesting way of going about it. Causes some tensions because the person who gets zero always ends up with what the hell, and ends up a bit disgruntled. And so navigating some of that is interesting. But I think some sort of credits or karma points or loyalty plan type of structure is a really powerful way. And I think the advent of cryptocurrencies gives us a really good way.
Right.
And we're going to see some amazing experiments of using tokens and utility tokens to navigate that. You know, we've created our own utility token inside our world, more as a means of payment than anything else. But we're hoping to use it as a more structured way of rewarding the community as time goes by.
You know, it's funny you say that, Salim, as well, because when I was at X Prize, we introduced, I don't know if it's still happening there now, but everybody had $50 that they could donate in pieces to their colleagues. And what was fascinating was that the two people who got the most amount of money consistently were the two people who worked in the front desk, because they helped everybody out, but didn't necessarily get as much recognition elsewhere in the. It's a fascinating model. So
yeah.
Great example. Love it. I know we have about 4 minutes left, so something I really would like to offer the attendees is kind of a list of the most impactful books or resources around community that you've read or utilized. Specifically, Prasanna asked for tools around recruiting community members. And yeah, just wanted to get a short list of some of those recommendations from both of you.
I mean, for me, sadly, there's not a lot of books out there about building communities, unfortunately. And this is where I'm going to become a horrible shill and promote my own book. Because I wrote this really because there wasn't a lot out there. I wrote this book called People Powered: How Communities Can Supercharge Your Business Brand and Teams. Our friend and mentor, Peter Diamandis, wrote the foreword for it. And it really goes over kind of the value proposition, a lot of what we're talking about today, in a very crisp model for how to go about building a community strategy, and then how to integrate it into a business. But I've actually found the most useful books for me aren't specifically about communities. It's just about things that relate to it. So for example, I'm a big fan of behavioral economics, because to me, we need to understand the psychology and the behavioral norms of human beings to really build great communities. Communities are like a program that runs on a machine, and that machine is the human brain. So I would say Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely, Nudge is another one. And then the other thing that I would say is a very final point, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is just brilliant for everything that anyone does. So I would definitely recommend that. And of course, Salim's book for sure. So.
Well, if I think about, you know, when we advise companies or advise groups or about how to implement the model, community is always number 1 or number 2 on the list. And I think getting the tools out there to grow community, I'll say it again, what we found was incentive prizes like X Prize and others are great for turning crowd into community. And then you need loyalty gamification programs to keep the community engaged and keep it thriving. Wikipedia is an amazing example of another global, pretty profound community that's making a huge difference. But I'll go back to the core MTP approach. That really becomes if you can get that right, then that becomes a galvanizing force that attracts everybody, or attracts a large number of people. And the dedication to the cause then gives people a very clear sense of how much do they want to play with this in this world.
Thank you both. And I like this last question from Nick Benson. Are there any examples or thoughts on internal communities and their ability to change an organization from the inside? Would 3M be an example?
3M less so. I think 3M is a very structured environment. I've spent a lot of time there in Minneapolis in February, talking to the company and to their leadership programs. They've done an amazing job. They do an amazing job. You know, everybody talks about Google's 20%. They give their researchers 30% free time to do whatever they want. And so by allowing them to play together and in groups, they really create an amazing outcome. And they're one of the best examples of good corporate citizenship that I've ever seen. They really, really live it. They're now churning out millions of face masks for the whole world, and turned their entire, even their most profitable lines of business have been co-opted to churn out thing. Because in the end, if you're not serving the community that created you, where are you, right? And big companies that are extractionary will, I think, suffer in the future. And the ones that leverage their community to build and be part and be good citizens in the ecosystem will do very well.
And very briefly, because I know we're at the end of the hour, but internal communities are incredibly powerful, but they're also very difficult to set up if you've already got a large organization. It requires executive permissiveness to build a community, and it requires on the ground support to enable your employees to know exactly what they should be doing, and then clear incentivization. But when you do it well, it's phenomenal. Santander, Bosch, Capital One, Microsoft, they're all great examples of that.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. We're going to wrap it here. And before we sign off, just going to ask Jono to share with the attendees on where they can find you and how they can track you down online.
Yeah, probably the easiest place is my website, Jono Bacon. It's Jono, bacon, like the delicious meat.com. And because I have a sufficiently stupid name, I'm the same on most of the social media networks as well. So, but this was a real pleasure, and it's great to spend time with everybody today. So,
yeah. Jono, where did you grow up in the UK?
I'm a mongrel. I was born in Northallerton in North Yorkshire, and then I was raised in the South in Bedfordshire and went to university in the Midlands. So I had this weird accent, and then I moved to California 12 years ago, and now I've got that American twang. So I just sound like an unusual, weird individual. So.
I spent almost a year living in Skipton and Bingley, by the way.
You're kidding me. I was born right near Skipton.
Yes.
Wow. Very close.
So
it's amazing.
All right.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much. And we'll have the recording available to all attendees afterwards. Everyone stay safe out there.
Great comments and great conversing with you, Jono.
Likewise.
Yes, thank you.
Take care, everyone. Stay safe.
Evan, thanks for
Bye.
setting this up. Take folks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.